So good evening, everyone. I will try to stick to time limits. Well, this study was carried out alongside my colleague, Carmen, from the University of Economics in Bratislava. So the title of this study is Intercultural Competence in Adult Language Learning through a Pedagogy of Multiliteracies, Systematic Review. And it's part of the project Multiliteracies for Adult at-risk learners of additional languages. The rationale of this study is to better know in which way education stakeholders, be it policymakers or educators, have dealt with intercultural competence in adult language learning, considering our current multicultural and digital context. So first of all, I will briefly describe three major issues. That is the different conceptualizations of intercultural competence, the principles of the pedagogy of multiliteracies, and then the implementation of intercultural competence in language learning curricula. Following this, I will present the main objective and the research questions. And next, I will describe the empirical study and the results, and I will bring this presentation to a close with a conclusion. So, let me start off by addressing the importance of conceptualization, the conceptualization of intercultural competence. In the literature body, we can find different terms like intercultural communicative competence, cultural competence, or cultural intelligence. In addition, we can find different terms, different prefixes in terms like multiculturality, pluriculturality, or transculturality, but with some slight differences here. As regards to the definitions, well, we can find multiple definitions on intercultural competence, but let me highlight the one proposed by Biako and his colleagues, who state that intercultural competence is the ability to experience otherness and cultural diversity, making it possible to establish cognitive and affective links between people, as well as to mediate between social groups and their cultures. But what does it mean to be an intercultural competent person? Well, let me highlight what Byron and Fleming states about this. So an intercultural competent individual is a person who has knowledge of one culture or more cultures and has the capacity to discover and relate to new people from other contexts. It would also be associated with other elements like the ones you can see in this table, for example, emotion management and empathy. And by contrast with a cultural alienated person would be someone who, shows a lack of interest towards other cultures or has no cultural empathy whatsoever. Also, for the purposes of this systematic review, research in the literature, the principles of the pedagogy of multiliteracies. I'm not going to stop here, so my colleagues have already described this in detail. But in a way, it's a reaction to definition of literacy, which goes beyond the traditional notions and which integrate different modes of communication in a wide variety of cultural texts. As for the term multiliteracies, it was coined by the New London Group, and it consists of these curricular components, which would be revisited by Cope and Calancis by means of this, by means of the Learning by Design project, in order to reflect in a way these knowledge processes. So the fundamental element here, I would say, is that language learners are no longer passive agents in their learning process, but they are, they play a pivotal role in the construction of meaning. So we need to take it into account. And this takes me to the next point, which is the implementation of intercultural competence into language learning curricula. And I would like to highlight what Starkey states here about a cultural approach to language learning, which should undermine narratives of citizenship that promote monolithic, homogeneous national identities as a sole possible sense of belonging. And in order to achieve this, a series of theories, frameworks, and guides have emerged, like the ones you can see here. But we can also find the autobiography of intercultural encounters as well. So let me take one step further here by considering the principles of the pedagogy of multiliteracies, which in a way scholars view it as a way to bridge the gap between those curricula aimed at beginners, whose main objective is to develop oral communication, and those curricula aimed at advanced learners, whose focusing is on literature or academic literacies, therefore separating what is language learning and cultural content. So as a consequence, there seems to be a gap in the education system with regard to the integration of language learning and cultural content through a pedagogy of multiliteracies. And this awareness is even more urgent if we consider those who are at a disadvantage, that is, those who are at risk of social exclusion, who try to navigate the complexities of our current multicultural context. So in order to deal with this scenario, the Council of Europe developed the project, linguistic integration of adult migrants, in order to offer state members some guidance on the linguistic integration and assessment of this population, of course, considering their specific needs. We can also say that there is a gap in the education system with regard to the training of future language teachers who are going to work with this population. So having said this, the main objective of this study is to offer a summary of studies on intercultural competence in adult language learning through a pedagogy of multiliteracies. But we also formulated the following research questions. The first question is regards the didactic tools that have been employed in order to develop this competence in adult language learning through a pedagogy of multiliteracies. The next question, we wanted to know if the principles of the pedagogy of multiliteracies were considered in the language learning curricula. With respect to the next question, we were interested in knowing if learners and instructors' perception were considered during this implementation. As for the next question, we wanted to know if values and feelings were considered as well. And finally, if adult at-risk learners were taken into account in these studies. So for this systematic review, we followed the PRISMA protocol, and in order to assess the quality of these studies, we used the mixed methods appraisal tool. So for our search strategy, we conducted this search by considering a combination of keywords like multiliteracies, foreign language and culture on the Web of Science, Scopus, and ERIC databases from their inception to January 2022, this year. So for every retrieve article, we consider the title, the abstract, and the keywords, which were confronted with a series of inclusion criteria. So, for example, if these studies included any reference to primary and secondary school students in their study designs, these studies were discarded. And by way of illustration, here you can see a flow diagram with a series of rounds of filtering. And after this process, we ended up with 9 qualitative studies that met these inclusion criteria. In order to address the research questions, we categorized these 9 qualitative studies into different areas. So we were mainly interested in these dimensions, as you can see here. I'm not going to stop now here. And as a result, the results suggest that, with regard to the mixed methods appraisal tool, overall score was assigned to each study. So as we can observe, 6 studies were rated 100%, 2 studies were rated 75%, and only one study was rated 50%. Now let me summarize what we found. First of all, data were collected from participants who started in collegiate contexts. As for the studies, they took place, or they carried out these studies mainly in the USA, but we can also find some multinational samples in other studies. As regards the target language, well, a variety of them were used, like French, English, or Spanish. Now, with respect to the research questions, first of all, we detected that these studies included a variety of didactic tools like multimodal texts, collaborative word processors, students' portfolios, blogs, or animation. With respect to the implementation of the principles and components of the pedagogy of multiliteracies, we have to say that to a greater or lesser extent, they consider some principles of this pedagogy, like the use of translanguaging, also multimodality or cultural diversity. However, a few studies followed the original components of the pedagogy of multiliteracies. Now, moving on to the next question, we observed that few studies included learners and instructors' perceptions or beliefs. Some of them including a kind of reflection towards the implementation of this pedagogy in the language learning curricula. With regard to values and feelings, well, there is little consideration of the affective domain. Also, there are some studies which include a brief description of how values and feelings are represented, but not enough. And finally, well, just to mention that only one study took into account adult at-risk learners. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, first of all, the results of the mixed methods appraisal tool suggest high quality research in this area, although I have to admit that, well, only 9 articles met the inclusion criteria. However, well, any representation of the pedagogy of multiliteracies remains scarce. As for the didactic tools, well, a wide variety then were used. Music is nowhere to be found, which caught us by surprise, because as we know, I mean, music is considered as an effective tool to mediate between cultures or in language learning. And with regard to the affective dimension, well, future studies should consider this as the social-emotional elements are essential when learning a language. And finally, just to mention that adult at-risk learners are misrepresented. So that means that future studies should consider this population. So we hope that this work contributes to existing knowledge on the pedagogy of multiliteracy